Thanks, comrades. I think a discussion now on events in Venezuela really assume a particular importance, because in Spain we've had a lot of the tremendous struggles in Catalonia over the course of the past period. But in Spain and throughout Latin America at this stage, you get an echo of it here in Britain. The ruling class and its media is using Venezuela as a club to beat the whole of the left with. In Spain, it's become one of the most important propaganda weapons that they have to use against Podemos, against the United Left, that if they come to power, you will see a simple repetition of the catastrophe which is unfolded under Chavez and then under Maduro in Venezuela. We have an echo of that here in relation to Corbyn. It's not really reached the same point here yet in terms of the propaganda campaign, but undoubtedly it is probably something that they will throw in the course of the general election campaign, when it will be posed as a more likely prospect of Corbyn coming to power. And more generally, it is being used at the present time by the ruling class internationally to broadly attempt to discredit the idea of socialism, which has begun to re-emerge in a stronger form in the US and in other countries and continents, as we've discussed in the course of this socialism weekend. They're trying to use the issue of Venezuela to discredit the very idea of socialism, in the same way as what they did following the collapse of the former Stalinist countries or former regimes in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. It's probably true to say at this stage, because of the depth of the crisis of capitalism, which is gripping the planet today, it will not have the same impact as what it did in 1992 as the Soviet Union fell apart. But nevertheless, it will have a certain impact, and it's important for us as socialists to be able to answer the propaganda points, but also there are important lessons for us here as revolutionary socialists to draw from the experience of the movement in Venezuela itself, because it has lessons in terms of how you proceed to build socialism. It has lessons as far as how a party should organise itself internally. It has lessons in terms of emphasising the crucial role of the independence of the working class itself in the carrying out of the revolution. But I think before coming to some of those points, maybe we should trace back a little bit to underline what did take place in Venezuela itself and why it had such an important impact. Because Chavez came to power in the elections in 1998. And as we commented at the time, his election campaign at that point represented the first turn, really, of the opening chapter of a new situation. Because prior to that, you'd had the onslaught of neoliberalism, which had taken place following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the election of Chavez in 1998 was really the first mass revolt against the neoliberal policies in the form of the election of a new left government. And in that sense, this was an extremely significant and important development, not only for Venezuela, but was a pointer to the perspective and the likelihood of a resurgence of the left, a resurgence of mass struggle of the working class and the youth against the neoliberal policies. And that, of course, was vindicated in the events that subsequently followed in the early part of this new century, of the 21st century itself. But if we go back to that position in 1998, you can see how the revolutionary processes and events unfolded. Chavez, when he came to power in 1998, had a very, very limited policy of reform. He didn't speak of socialism. His policy of reform, if Ian Mearns put it, that we used to dub Jeremy Corbyn as a mamby-pamby liberal in the 1970s, well, Chavez's policy was probably a little bit to the right of what Jeremy Corbyn is putting forward at this stage. There was no threat or policy of nationalisation. He spoke of a Bolivarian revolution, as he said, of independence of Venezuela, clean up the corrupt political institutions, and usher in a reform policy that would make society more equal. And that was as far as it went. There was very little of a concrete character there. But having come to power, he did then begin to introduce some measures. And the very fact that he took some very, very mild reform measures was enough to provoke the reaction of the ruling class. That was enough to terrify them that they weren't prepared to tolerate, in this situation, any government that came to power that was not prepared to carry out just a crude neoliberal policy of mass privatisations and attacks on living standards. But and for that reason, they organised a systematic campaign, together with US imperialism, to try and undermine the Chavez regime itself and to overthrow it. As comrades will probably be aware, that culminated really at that stage in the attempted military coup in 2002. And really it's from that point we saw a decisive turn in the situation. You had the attempted military coup, which, had they pulled it off, would have ushered in a vicious military police dictatorship, which would have crushed the movement. That was the perspective that they had at the time. It was reflected during the coup itself, a particularly pernicious layer of the right-wing oligarchs together with the military. And that coup really collapsed, as comrades will be aware. But the crucial turning point in the situation was, why did it collapse? It was not really the response of Chavez that defeated the coup. It was a spontaneous uprising, a mass movement from below, of hundreds of thousands, millions that flooded out of the streets, from the shanty towns to the poor areas, particularly in Caracas itself. And our comrades at the time were participating in that particular movement. And then, most importantly, Chavez had a base amongst the military, and there's very important political points there in terms of a radicalisation and a split that had taken place within the Venezuelan armed forces. Whole sections, including the paratroopers, broke ranks from supporting the coup and went over to support Chavez. And the coup, of course, collapsed. And that represented a decisive turning point. The masses had come onto the street with the idea, spontaneously, they were going to advance the revolution, defeat the reaction. They didn't have a clear idea necessarily of what Chavez needed to do. But what they knew they did not want was a return to the old position where the rotten, corrupt elite, which had ruled Venezuela for generations, was simply left back in power. And that movement of the masses ushered in a whole period of radicalisation. It pushed Chavez much further to the left than what he intended to do. It was then, from that point on, that he began to speak, well, it was a little bit later actually, but he began to speak about the socialist tasks of the revolution. You saw a movement from below which took the form of factory occupations and the demand for nationalisation of the industries. Chavez himself was compelled at that stage to introduce a series of very far-reaching reforms which benefited whole sections of the working class, particularly in health. And you saw it at the time with the opening up of community clinics, which hadn't been there before, of Cuba supplying doctors into the areas, the opening up of the education, where millions were given places in basic, but nevertheless they were given places in universities from the poorest areas, in measures which were enormously popular, based on this mass radicalisation which had taken place. And all of those blows that were struck against capitalism at the time represented an important step forward. But there were two crucial factors and weaknesses really in the situation, the price of which the movement in Venezuela is now paying for. Because while Chavez had moved in that direction, spoke about socialism for the first time in about 2004, 2005, opposed the issue of nationalisation, had spoken in an extremely radical way, even quoting Trotsky at one particular point. Nevertheless, the policy really was one of a double-faced policy, speaking a very revolutionary form of words about abolishing capitalism, about building a people's and a workers' militia, about workers' control, all of which Chavez did speak about. But then on the other side, the measures that he took were of entirely a different character. The nationalisation programme that was introduced was not a classic nationalisation programme of expropriation. Most of it was comprised really of joint enterprises, either with existing Venezuelan capitalist companies or with some of the multinational multinational companies themselves. And they had a sort of halfway house position. Chavez was left really in a halfway position, speaking of revolution, but not taking the decisive measures to take the revolution to a conclusive step forward and abolish capitalism in its entirety. And then there was another crucial weakness, and that situation, that weakness of Chavez had not been prepared to go the whole way, was undoubtedly has lessons here for Corbyn in the future. We have a whole series of historical lessons where it had been applied before and tried before, of trying to compromise and make a certain peace with capitalism. For example, in Chile, between 70 and 73, Allende had done the same thing, and always it had ended in catastrophe. Always what it did was allow the ruling class time to regroup their forces, time to reorganise, and then also conduct a policy of economic sabotage and boycotts, which is exactly what they did. And of course, all of that was backed up to the hilt by the policies of US imperialism, who also wanted to remove the regime. So that was one of the crucial weaknesses. The other critical factor, and this is one of the most important lessons to draw from this process and experience, was the fact that it was always conducted on a top-down basis. It was not on the basis of an independent movement of a democratic character from the working class from below. Chavez never had the perception of the working class being in the leadership of the revolution in Venezuela. Coming from the military represented a radicalisation. The psychology that he and others deployed was really, you support us, we will do it. We will carry out the necessary measures with your support when we need it. We need your support when they attempted the coup. Come onto the streets to defend us, but then we will carry out the necessary policies. And there was not the introduction of a genuine school of democratic workers' control and democratic workers' management and democratic check and accountability. And inevitably in that situation, we can discuss in a moment why that situation developed in Venezuela, because there are important historical parallels with it. Inevitably in that situation, where there's no accountability, where there's no check and control, you inevitably see the crystallisation of a bureaucratic caste beginning to take place. Because following the coup in 2002, there was a big purge took place, and the most reactionary officers in the army, they were driven out, sacked, and what have you. There were other measures that were taken at different layers. But you saw the emergence of this new Chavista movement, which threw up a whole layer of people. But because there was no check and control from below, there was not the election of democratic committees to control the position. Everything was done through the state and party apparatus itself. You saw the crystallisation of a new bureaucratic layer with perks and privileges. And in reality, what you saw is a process quite similar to what we've seen in South Africa, was the crystallisation really of a new ruling class who had robbed the wealth, particularly from the oil revenues, had taken all sorts of perks and privileges, very similar to what took place with the African National Congress in South Africa, of a layer that promoted itself, enriched itself, and became really a new layer of a very upper middle class or semi-capitalist class with its own particular perks and privilege. And that is exactly what took place in Venezuela. It was done on the basis, we saw the launching of a new trade union federation, to give the comrades an idea. It was not a trade union federation born out of the struggle of the workers themselves from below. It was decreed and formed by the state, by the government of Chavez. The party that he launched, which had millions going to its ranks, it is true, but it was not formed from below by workers. It was launched and initiated by Chavez's own forces. In the committee that organised it, there were 3 serving generals from the army at the time, which gives an indication as to how it was put together. Had mass support, mass participation, but not a genuine structure of democracy and check. Now, why was that the situation? And then compounded onto that, everything was figured around the personality of Chavez. I don't know if other comrades had visited Venezuela, maybe comrades had done there, but I've been there a number of times when Chavez was there, and it was quite astounding to see it. Chavez everywhere, massive posters. Chavez, breakfast, dinner and tea. Everything was determined by Chavez. He spoke to the rawest, poorest sections, had enormous confidence in Chavez, but they saw him as a god. And some of them would use the term, our God Chavez, who's going to provide. Chavez will provide the reforms, the health care. Chavez will provide. It was not the consciousness that we are making this revolution as ourselves. Now, there's very important reasons why that took place. Partly it was a reflection of the of the general international situation that existed at the time. There are also particular factors which are quite peculiar to Venezuela. Venezuela never had the long traditions of independent workers' parties and trade unions that other countries in Latin America had had. Take Chile, for example, the Communist Party, formed in 1918. You had the Mass Communist Party, getting 18–20% of the vote at its peak. You had the Mass Socialist Party, the Trade Union Federation, formed over a whole series of struggles. The same could be said in relation to Brazil, where you had the CUT, and then it was a later development of the Mass Communist Party, then the PT was formed. There was a whole tradition of independent workers' organisations, of a layer of workers that were schooled in the struggle and traditions, that were debating. If you take the Chilean Revolution 70 to 73, Allende had enormous authority, but it was never perceived as a god. It was never perceived, Allende is making this revolution. It was the slogan at the time, it's the workers are leading this process. Allende would go to meetings. You had the Mass Communist Party, the different factions of the Socialist Party, the MIR. There'd be a whole series of debates. We have comrades now who were around at the time. They would describe Allende would go to meetings, and sometimes he'd be booed by workers in the factions. He had authority, but he was not perceived as a godlike figure that Chavez was reflecting that lack of tradition. The Trade Union Federation in Venezuela was never formed until the 1930s, let alone any parties. There were no independent parties on a mass scale in that form, and that gave a certain twist to the position in terms of the absence of traditions which existed. But then we've seen, of course, the death of Chavez and a dramatic worsening of the situation. And that was compounded by two things. One thing you'll find that is probably quite common in Venezuela at the moment is the idea, well, Maduro's a disaster. If Chavez had lived, everything would have been okay. Because if you look back, Chavez, the economic catastrophe that you have now in Venezuela, was not as acute at all as what it was under Chavez. The reform program had run into lots of problems. There were, the emergence of the bureaucratization of the reform policy had created all sorts of obstacles, but it wasn't as catastrophic as what it is now. And the main reason for that was, of course, the price of oil. They had the resources. Oil prices up till the death of Chavez was very high and remained high. It's really collapsed, relatively speaking, over the course of the past period. Maduro has simply not the same history as Chavez had. You had the bureaucratization, which has got even stronger, along with the corruption, and now you have an absolute disaster facing the social and economic situation within Venezuela. And Maduro himself, under the impact of this, how is he responding? If we go back to a few months ago, you had the elections to the so-called Constituent Assembly. To try and buy peace with the ruling class, what he'd done fundamentally was shifted further to the right, in exactly the same way that Dilma had in Brazil a few months earlier. She'd swung to the right in the vain hope that that was going to convince the right wing not to impeach her in the Congress. She went in the more right-wing direction. Of course, they wouldn't wear that and move towards impeachment. Maduro fundamentally applied the same policy. Switch more to the right, go for some privatisations, unpick some of the reform packages, and maybe we can find a bit of support from the right and prevent action being taken against us. And of course, it's turned into an economic catastrophe. The situation has gone bad to worse. partly as a product, it is true, of economic sabotage by the ruling class in Venezuela and by the US measures that they've taken. That is true, but it's not the whole story. It's inefficiency, companies breaking down, and an incredible degree of corruption which exists. And you have now really a complete collapse economically and socially, where starvation is on the order of the day. We have comrades there. One comrade, William, came to our last meeting last December. In the course of the previous 12 months, he'd lost 15 kilos in weight. You know, it probably did him some good, but you know, it's on the basis all that's available is rice and beans, and there's just massive shortages of even the basic staples needed for life. They're expecting now that the inflation rate next year will probably hit 2,000 to 3,000% a year, is what they're anticipating. It's a complete social collapse and disintegration. But on the other side, we've seen the right attempting to mobilise, and they did make gains. It'd be wrong for us to underestimate that. I mean, if you go back to the period of Chavez, they were on, Chavez was on 60–65% of the vote. In the elections to the National Assembly, as comrades are probably aware, the right-wing coalition parties got a majority in the National Assembly. That represented an important shift of demoralisation, layers of workers not turning out to vote, the middle class swinging conclusively behind the right. But they've also got stuck, because the interesting thing is, in the position, if you've got RC opinion polls, even as some of the right-wingers on demonstrations, what they actually support, do you support the complete abolition of Chavez's reform programme, the missions as they call it? And they say no, the majority still support the reform programme. The right increased its support, but really there's a standoff in the situation. They haven't yet got the momentum which is sufficient to overthrow the Maduro regime. The Maduro regime, on the other side, is stuck in a capitalist prison, has no perspective of advancing the revolution towards socialism. And really you have two bands, two groups. One of the old ruling elite, now facing really a bureaucratic caste, which is also resting on this new wing of the capitalist class, the bully bourgeoisie as they call it, and the army at this stage, who have their own business interests in the new ventures as well, and they're just locked, and the situation is really a stalemate at this particular point in time, which is obviously leading to a miserable position as far as the mass of the working class is concerned. Exactly how it developed, frankly, is extremely unclear. Do the right have the basis at this stage to move conclusively to strike a blow at Maduro and remove him? Well, the problem they have is they don't have the military with them. The majority of the military remain supporting Maduro for their own economic interests at this particular stage. They don't have the forces on the streets. They're able to move conclusively to overthrow him, and big layers of the population, as reflected in the recent local elections, still would have the attitude of a hatred towards Maduro, prepared to give a block of support to Maduro in order to prevent the right coming back into power. It's an extremely complicated position. Exactly how it will develop is wholly unclear at this particular section. There is a dissident section of the Chavistas which are present. That was reflected in some of the recent elections, where the unofficial candidates on the PSTU list of the Chavista party in Caracas as a whole got about 200,000 votes, you know, as opposed to the millions that went to allegedly to the PSTU officials. So there is a dissident Chavista movement, out of which possibly a new workers' party, a new workers' movement we could look towards, possibly emerging at some stage. But nevertheless, it poses the question of an impasse in the situation at this stage. How long it will last, we will have to see. And the key task that we would have is to orientate and intervene in this Chavista movement, the dissident Chavista movement, during the central lessons from it, and the critical ones of that are the 2 points I made earlier. One, you can't make half a revolution and not to go forward an overthrow capitalism conclusively. And two is the question of any revolutionary movement, if it's going to be genuine, if it's going to advance in a healthy way, cannot be carried through on a top-down, bureaucratic, administrative basis. And those are the two central lessons I think we would have to draw from that. And we have to equip ourselves to be able to answer to that, because this campaign that this is the consequence of socialism is bound to be used, as it has been in Spain and other countries a little bit here. It will be stepped up here, probably in the run-up to an election by the right against Corbyn. And we, of course, as socialists, have to be able to explain exactly what happened, that that was not the completion of the revolution. The failure in Venezuela is precisely the failure to carry through the revolution to its ultimate consequence. And I think, comrades, those are the main lessons that we have to draw from that, and of course then put it in its context to look for a revival of the movement at a certain stage. It will take time. It's not going to be an instant development. Of course, that is linked to other upheavals shaking the rest of the continent of Latin America. What takes place now, the battles between the left and the right, the workers' movement in the United States is of crucial importance for this as well. But we have to draw those lessons from it to be able to apply them and ensure that we play our part in contributing to the movement nationally and internationally, drawing the lessons of why Venezuela has been such a catastrophe now and a failure, and what the lessons are for the Venezuelan workers and for the international movement for the working class. Comrades, I think comrades have raised some very probing and very good questions and made some very good points. Just to go quickly through the immediate questions and some of the other points that came up in the discussion. Firstly, on Telesul, it's the Venezuelan government. It's launched by Chavez, and it plays two roles. Its international coverage is very good. Actually, if you follow it, particularly the Spanish thing, it has very good coverage about workers' struggles in Europe. You know, the stuff from Catalonia has been good, and in terms of being informative. But in terms of its domestic coverage, it really follows the line. And I mean, I would just clarify, when we say this starvation, it's not like mass famine. I mean, it's just acute food shortages. I mean, it is hunger, but it's not like a sort of the African images you have of hunger, you know, in Africa and some of the famines, etc. It's not that. It's just acute shortages of everything. Of medicine. It's not just food. It's medicine and everything. And you know, the government just tries to cover the whole thing up on the basis of denying that it, that it exists, and there is a problem. It's probably possibly true the right wing exaggerate the issues, but this is always the problem, or has been the problem in the whole of the process in Venezuela. Sometimes the right, even under Chavez, they made some valid points from their own point of view and was then used, but the left did not answer it sufficiently. And the comrade was posing the issue of Chris, the issue of the oil company. There was a very instructive point about the weakness of the Chavista movement at the very beginning of the process, when you had the lockout. And we had comrades who had relations and friends who worked in the oil company. And you have you had a sort of middle layer who were not particularly politicised, but they were in key strategic positions. And you had the right-wing layer, who obviously were against Chavez and doing what they did. Chavez, in a ham-fisted way, the sacking of 18,000, he just sacked them all. There was absolutely no attempt made to try and win a layer over or neutralise them, appeal to that section who would be technicians, skilled workers, who didn't really know what the hell was going on. Many of them were not involved in it, but there was no attempt to try and neutralise them or win them to the side. And in doing that, in a process where you have such a polarisation, it is in effect a policy to just push them over to support the right wing in a position. And there's a very important lesson there for the workers' movement in general, especially in a revolution. Obviously we will base ourselves on the working class being the spearhead of the revolution, of being the decisive force in it. But we have a vested interest in appealing to the sections of the middle class, even the sections of the upper middle class, and certainly the state machine and its different layers to try and neutralise them, and a section of which can come over. And what they failed to do, because they had no clear rounding out to the position. You see, Tiki posed the question about Chavez himself. I mean, who knows? The guy demonstrated he was probably quite genuine in the sense of what he wanted to do. He wanted to end the misery. He reacted against it. You know, his history goes back, the attempted coup that he carried out in '92 against the old regime. It was from a military point of view, tried to trigger an uprising. He was radicalised, as was a whole section of the officer caste in the Venezuelan army, like they were in the Portuguese Revolution, because of the conditions that existed in Venezuela. The Caracasso in '88, '89, when the army was deployed, they think they shot about, estimates vary, but 2,000 or 3,000, whatever, were gunned down. It had a phenomenal effect on radicalising Chavez and a whole section of the junior officers. And you want that section to come over to the side of the revolution. But unless they're consciously involved with a conscious movement of the working class and a healthy workers' party to integrate, to check and control, even those sections with the best intentions are lost at sea in the storm of events. And that is really what happened, I think, with Chavez. He was completely lost. And then you're under all sorts of pressures. He hasn't got the schooling of a party, of a revolutionary party, which would, you know, not as individuals, but will be told and schooled in the Russian Revolution, the defeats in Chile, the Spanish Civil War, all of that experience to draw upon to try and he had none of that. And then he's faced with the position. So you had the coup in 2002. You had this mass movement. He's down on these islands, flown back. You have this marvellous movement of hundreds of thousands, millions in Caracas. You know, our comrades described at the time how they went there. People had got pistols. They were down there, and then they were up at that position to defeat the right and to go the whole way, to just clear out the whole of the old rotten regime. Chavez comes back, and he falls into the classic trap because he's got no orientation. Well, now we go, comrades, for a policy of national reconciliation. And he opens up a dialogue with the very people who had arrested him and who had probably executed him. You know, if he'd have done it, it was a classic position. And it's the issue of having a strong party which is there, which has drawn the lessons from the past and is capable of applying them to the current position. Now, of course, with the economic position, we've had the intervention of US imperialism. By the way, they were up to their eyeballs. The idea that they denied it at the time of any participation in the coup. They were up to their eyeballs in the attempted coup in 2002. You had 2 US frigates off the coast of Venezuela. I mean, that wasn't just an accident. They were there giving advice and training and what have you. But they've had a policy of economic attacks on Venezuela, but it's had its limits as well, because, you know, they're very practical. They put sanctions on some of Venezuela's exports, but Venezuela, its biggest, the highest percentage of its exports of oil, where does it go? It goes to the US. Well, the one thing they haven't stuck a sanction on is oil, because of the effects it would have on the world economy. So it's been a bit muted, but there have been in there starving them of funds and what have you. Now, one of the comrades posed the question: what's the difference between the policy of Maduro and the right wing? And economically, in the elections that took place recently, it was very interesting. There's 2 aspects of the right-wing economic policy. I was in Venezuela at the time of the last election when Chavez was elected as presidency. He won it with a small majority, or a reduced majority, but he won it. And what struck me was the programme and the leaflets and the posters of the right wing. There was nothing about privatisation. Their real policy of neoliberalism, they didn't utter a word about it. It was completely masked. And it was a measure of how far that they couldn't put their real position forward. And there is an element of that there now. Maduro tried to go in a more pro-capitalist direction in the run-up to constituent assemblies. But in the elections before that, for the National Assembly, etc., the right wing never attacked Maduro's economic policy on concrete issues of what he was doing. Didn't say a word about it. They were denouncing for the shortages, They were denouncing for the repression, there was a communist regime, and etc. But the actual specific policies that he'd done and proposed in terms of joint ventures and different things, they didn't say a word about it, because they can't, because it was really a pro-capitalist position, and on the specific economic policies he's applied in the recent period, they probably wouldn't do a great deal that is different. What happens with the debt default, which is now posed, is another question, but it's a measure of how far to the right that Maduro has gone on the one side, and also on the other side, notwithstanding the defeat that has taken place, the disillusionment, the anger which is there, there's not really a thirst to go back to the old policies of the old regime, of a pure neoliberal agenda. And that's true in the whole of Latin America, by the way, because the neoliberal, it's a bit like Britain. The neoliberalism in Latin America was started first. I mean, Germany, France, and that are way behind in terms of what's been carried through. Britain's a somewhat different position. But if you take Brazil, for example, with the movement against Dilma, on the upper middle, and this is general, it applies probably in Venezuela as well, on the upper middle class demonstrations that took place, organised by the parties to the right, what were all the opinion polls? You want to get rid of Dilma? Yes. Support change of government? Yes. Bring Dilma down. Do you support privatisation of the state oil company? No. Do you support the privatisation of the health system? No. Do you support privatisation of education? No. And that's the upper middle class layer. It's not like an ideological swing to the right that's taken place in Latin America. It's more bitter disappointment with the left, which has been there, and in Venezuela it's acute because of how far the revolution went, and it went a lot further than some of the other movements that we saw, at least in Brazil and Argentina. I'll come on to some of the other countries in a moment, because there is another aspect, I'll not deal with it now, there's another aspect of a loss of opportunity here, because in one sense, if you look at what's taken place internationally, it was such a criminal loss of opportunity. With Venezuela, had Chavez been prepared to go the whole way, and let's say you had a healthy revolution, what scenario would have taken place? Venezuela was in a position, this was erupting in Venezuela at the time as you had the civil war in Bolivia with Morales, and he won it. You'd had Ecuador going in the same position. They had every prospect there to complete the revolution in all of those countries, and you could have established a socialist federation, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. And that wouldn't have resolved everything. But what an alternative point of reference it could have become, and it would have helped them to at least take more tentative measures to withstand the economic crisis which followed with the collapse of oil, etc., and to begin a sort of integration. And it could have had an effect in Brazil and other countries to start with. That then coincided, you imagine that. It was only a few years later you had the Greek crisis erupt. If you had a socialist federation of 4 or 5 countries in Latin America on a democratic basis, you got an immediate opening for Cyprus, with the crisis that took place in the US and the emergence of the Sanders movement, with a genuine democratic socialist federation. Even on the basic layer of the impact, you could have had an entirely different world scenario actually to what has broken in the course of the past period. But that is why it's such a criminal loss of the position. I think comrades raised some very important other points. Chris's points on it's not true to say it was just a top-down approach. Well, you're right, Chris. In the sense there was a mass participation in the neighbourhood committees and some of the other structures that took place in the initial period when the movement was at its height. It's not true to say they were not there, but the point was it was like a conveyor belt. The government will come and control it. The party officials will control it. The workers will be in these meetings, but it will be a conveyor belt. And as soon as they rose in the meetings, we had comrades who had positions in some of these neighbourhood councils. You get up and made an alternative proposal or point, then you're driven out and isolated, marginalised, campaign conducted against you. You're a counter-revolutionary, you this, that and the other. And it was in that sense that it was not a conscious democratic control from from below in any of those positions. Now, there were elements in some of the factories that were occupied in the initial period of a genuine element of workers' control, but it wasn't integrated into a proper plan. You know, it was left at plant level, and that was it. And then, after a period of time where you had the elements of workers' control, the bureaucracy from the party and the union would be back getting control of the position, and then you get your own vested interests of the different bureaucracy. Army captains, and that were appointed as managers by the government of some of the expropriated factories, and they were just dishing out orders like they were back in the army once they were there, and inevitably that had its consequences. So, but it was more like a conveyor belt of top down, and that you know has existed in other situations. There was big elements in that sense of what happened in Cuba. As at the initial stages. That was a similar position you had there with the committees for the defence of the revolution. Now, Ted, I think it was, posed a question, a very interesting question. Why didn't the traditions develop in Venezuela of mass independent workers' parties? Well, it's a very pertinent question. I don't think you can give a definitive answer. It is true in a number of countries in the neo-colonial world, you have not seen the emergence of independent workers' parties. The movement has tended to go around more bourgeois, capitalist, nationalist, radical parties. Argentina was the case of the Peronists, which was a very peculiar formation in its own right, and it developed under the General Perón, implementing massive reforms, but an amazingly complicated movement. It's the most complicated political movement for Trotskyists to deal with. I mean, there's probably nowhere else in the world where on the one side you have hardline neo-fascists in the same party as armed guerrillas who defend Marxism, you know, all in the same party. I mean, it was a very peculiar phenomenon, which was Argentinian. But you've had in other countries, I mean, South Africa, you had a strong communist party, but the movement was through the ANC, which was very radical, but it wasn't an independent workers' party as such. In Pakistan, you had the PPP, and a mass party never developed there. It's different in India. Now, in Venezuela, I suspect it was more along those lines. You had sort of some populist type of capitalist parties that were there. Historically, the working class was mainly concentrated in the oil sector, which was a very privileged sector at one stage in terms of the wages they were getting, etc. And the rest of the workers' movement was then pretty dispersed, and you had the capitalist parties, and some of them could appear quite radical and liberal, including in their social reform policies at the height of the oil boom in the 1960s and 70s. That was the case. Now, but you never saw the emergence of independent parties on a mass scale. The Communist Party was only formed at about, I think it was 33, 34. So in other words, it was born as a Stalinist party from the very outset, and it's never got more than about 2 or 3% of the vote. It had a base in the trade unions, but the trade union federations that were founded in 38, in the 40s, it just alternated between control between the two main capitalist parties, the Kobai and the Christian social movement. I mean, it was like just alternate one to the other, and generally mass parties never developed, which was very distinct to what you saw in other countries, particularly in Chile, but in Bolivia, where you had the mass Trotskyist party. It was sectarian, but the POR was there with a massive base amongst the Bolivian miners in the past. You have in Chile the Communist Party, where you have a marvellous tradition. It's been eliminated now, but I mean, there's an individual there who founded it he's not given his due international weight historically. Luis Recobar formed the trade unions, formed the Communist Party, elected the Congress, got a donkey, went all around the country launching workers' papers, went to Moscow for the founding congress of the Comintern, goes back, he's had interviews with Lenin and Trotsky, marvellous, he's a bit like James Connolly actually in that's the Chilean version, but tragically committed suicide as the party degenerated. But none of that was really there in Venezuela, and then it split, the Communist Party, and you went into a few guerrilla outfits, and it never develops in a more classic way, which is a factor. It's not the only factor, but it is a factor in terms of shaping how the events there have developed over the course of the past period and during this particular movement itself. Now, other comrades raised the important question of the Constituent Assembly, which the elections which had taken place recently, and it's a very complicated position. There is a very unclear situation, and because normally, you see, and this is where Maduro is still playing a bit of a balancing role. His policy has gone to the right. He's still capable of using a bit of radical, quasi-revolutionary rhetoric, and he's calling the Constituent Assembly, as he announces it, to advance the revolution and defeat the counter-revolution. That was the main emphasis that they were putting forward, because they'd lost the control of the Constituent Assembly. And by the way, the paradox of that, the whole constitution they got in Venezuela was, of course, Chavez's constitution, which was presented as the most revolutionary constitution in history, as how it was sold, and they had the Constituent Assembly, and of course they lost control of it. Now, normally under other situations, and in effect by convening the Constituent Assembly, what it did was close the National Assembly, the Parliament was closed. Now, there's an interesting historical point there, because that issue's come up before. It came up in 70 to 73 in Chile, where the right wing had control of the Congress, the left had the presidency, and the Congress was being used to block and derail everything. The left had won all the by-elections, the local elections, but the Congress was being used as a means of sabotaging the government. And the chant came up from the masses below, the most left-wing section of the Chilean movement, close the Congress and for people's popular power, in other words, alternative councils. Now, in that situation, it was correct to do that, because it was a means of attacking the counter-revolution to take the revolution forward. In the case of Venezuela, the same rhetoric is being used, but in an entirely different situation. It was just a mechanism to protect the wing around Maduro, which of course the right wing then proceeded to boycott. So we would not have advocated the convening of elections to a Constituent Assembly. It resolved absolutely nothing in terms of the position, and was not seen as an instrument to carry further the revolutions. But it is interesting, the results. 8.5 million voted for the governing parties. Zelaya voted for dissident Chavistas. I'll come back to that point in a moment. But it illustrates that there's still a certain layer that are there. I mean, what you have advocated, but it didn't really matter. There was no other candidates. I mean, it was a few candidates and a few dissidents were there, which you could have advocated supporting for. And then, as Tiki said, the elections that took place subsequently, indicated there's a certain firming up of the support for the government, or it appears to be the case, probably in reaction to the right wing. So, but it's a reflection of the impasse, which is just there, it's stuck, the whole position, and will likely probably will decay and rot further unless there is a decisive break in the situation, which is probably not the most likely development in the course of the short term, because of the demoralisation which exists. So I think, comrades, those would be the main points. I'll come back on the dissident Chavistas. I mean, it's difficult to quantify. It's there, but it's not in an organised form. It's not like an organised group or faction or party or anything like that. It's dissident layers around the trade unions who've been around the party, who are against what the government's doing. Alaya did not want the elections to the Constituent Assembly. They think the government's been betrayed. Alaya probably have illusions that had Chavez lived, it would be much better. Others will be maybe looking a bit further. And it's extremely difficult to quantify exactly what it is at this stage. As I say, it's not organised, it's manifest. In the Constituent Assembly elections, you had a number of thousands of people who said they wanted to stand, and their policy was critical of the Chavista movement. Most of them were frozen out of the process by the bureaucracy. But it's an early position. Now, there are meetings there. There's the Communist Party has meetings with some others. The different fronts are there of trade union activists or workers. And our comrades would just basically intervene in that, arguing for the dissident Chavistas to regroup and to launch, draw the lessons and to move towards a new party, really, is what we would argue for, in terms of this stage. But it's probably going to be a situation that remains in an impasse for a period, although that could, of course, dramatically change with a change in the international situation, but we have to see. So I think, comrades, those are the main points I think in reply to the discussion. We have, of course, to draw the lessons of what has taken place there, and also how you intervene. And these processes are not static. We should not underestimate, at the height of the revolutionary movement, the enormous authority and support that has existed for Chavez and for the Chavista movement. And what was our task in that? You could not approach it just by denouncing Chavez. As we approached at the time, we intervened in that, supported the reforms, but then in a positive way put forward proposals for the formation of committees, elected delegates, subject to recall, no official to receive more than the average wage of a worker, to complete the nationalisation policy, institute a proper socialist democratic plan, and proposals for a genuine system of workers' control and workers' management to run such a kind of thing, and propose that as positive steps necessary to take forward the revolution. That would be the most effective way of intervening, as we did when the revolution was at its height. Now, of course, it's a question of being much sharper because of the decay and the swing to the right of the government. The dissolutions. I mean, we cannot defend, and it puts us under enormous pressure because of the attacks from the ruling class, but we cannot defend the indefensible. Prior to the constituency elections, Chavez cancelled the elections to the regional local councils. He also cancelled the elections to trade union federations. I mean, it's indefensible steps as far as revolutionary socialists are concerned. Some of the violence is also indefensible. That's a very mixed position. I mean, it's pure hypocrisy from the right, as one of the comrades said. I mean, it's been vicious, some of the violence from the far right. They've got a young student who was burnt alive. I mean, it's been absolutely vicious, some of the measures that have been taken there. On the other side, it's also true, the state machine of Maduro has been used against sections of the working class that have moved to question and have moved into struggle and to take strike action, which is equally, of course, indefensible. And we will have to advocate a position of defence committees being formed of the neighbourhoods, in the workplaces, etc., with no trust at all in the, in effect, paramilitary organisations that the Chavista, or the government has formed over the course of the past period. So I think those are the main points, comrades, that we need to draw out of that, out of this process, really, and to see it as an anticipation of future eruptions that will take place in the course of the next period, including in Venezuela, and based on drawing the lessons from that, of course, we can assist workers drawing the right conclusions for the tasks necessary to complete a revolution, and on a much healthier basis, on the basis of a genuine system of workers' democracy.